Okay, so thank you. I'm glad to be here to share with you some of the results that we've been collecting over roughly 20 years now. So, Laura mentioned, most of my research is conducted in mixed wood stands that would be upland uh, stands with cedar. So my plan and my aim here is to provide you with a synthesis of the past research that we've been conducting and give you some preview of the research that we are conducting right now. So basically, I will start with some of the studies that we have completed. So we look at the historical abundance of cedar. We look at the dynamics of natural stand, both in terms of regeneration and growth dynamics. And then we also did a study with experimental partial cuts where we looked at the effect of cutting intensity, browsing, seedbed type, and seed abundance. We also studied some operational partial cut that were conducted 20 to 30 years before, and then we looked for both regeneration and growth also. And finally, we had a study on growth of cedar in plantations in eastern Quebec. So the first study that I'll be discussing here is about the evolution of cedar dominance. And for this, we used land survey records that were done prior to industrial forestry. So we kept study land survey records that were conducted prior to 1940. And if you look at the graph, the first map here, you will see that the cedar was quite abundant in many places in southern Quebec. And the lower St. Lawrence was a region where it was quite abundant. And here, when we talk about dominance, it is that cedar was reported as the first species in the stand. We compare that to modern plots, and the bottom graph here, you see the difference. And you see here that you have important regions where we have seen a strong decrease in cedar abundance, cedar dominance. But at the same time, you see some red dots here that corresponds to increases in cedar dominance. And even though we don't completely understand what is going on there, one element that we found is that the increase in cedar was associated with agricultural abandoned land. So, and we've seen that in some of our field tours where former pasture land was abandoned and finally was invaded by cedar, possibly from seeds that came from adjacent lowland sites that were not converted to agriculture, but this would remain to be tested. Most of our studies were conducted in mixed-wood stands in western Quebec, so here in this region. So we had a short-term study, we had long-term study, and the plantations that we'll be presenting was in the lower St. Lawrence, and we also used some data from the Penobscot experimental forest. And in these mixed wood stands, the main companion species are yellow birch, balsam fir, red maple, sugar maple, and hemlock. So in order to understand the natural dynamics of these stands, we targeted some old stands that would correspond to the type 2 FSC old growth stand that Laura discussed a bit. So these stands had many of the old growth attributes, but still were partially harvested a long time before. So Laura mentioned the importance of microtopography on lowland side, but we also found that it was a factor in upland side. Here, if you look at mounds, they were present in 40% of the stand. They covered 40% of the ground, but 40% of the seedlings were on mounds, whereas this covered less than 20% of the stand. And quite importantly, the deadwood was a major factor in terms of places where the seedlings were rooted. So you see that the seedlings were rooted about 60% of the time in deadwood, but deadwood accounted for only 20% of the forest floor. This has been seen before for other light-seeded species, and it could be partly because of the litter layer is thinner on mounds, and that deadwood is a substrate that can keep a lot of humidity for germination. Laura mentioned that quite often cedars start as a suppressed tree and then gains access to the main canopy over time. And here we have a retrospective analysis of cedar growth in these stands, and this is the blue line here. And what you see here, the red arrows point out to 3 known spruce bollworm outbreaks in the region. And you see here that balsam fir clearly shows the impact of these outbreaks. And what you see here also is that cedar, in many cases, was able to take advantage of these outbreaks. So cedar can live longer, much longer than balsam fir, and then through these kinds of disturbances is able to reach into the main canopy over time through successive suppression and release periods. The study I mentioned about where we conducted experimental treatment, we wanted to test the effect of browsing, seed rain, the amount of cutting, level of harvesting, and also the kind of seedbed that was present. So I won't comment much about the browsing effect here because we had a very low deer population. Well, in fact, no deer in that region. So the browsing was not a main factor. But if you look at this region here, you see that we had an uncut control. We had a 25% basal area removal, 50% basal area removal, and 625 square meter gap. And you see that the best establishment after 2 years was in the light selection cut, which removed only 25% of the basal area. But in this Mixedwood stand, one can imagine that the seed rain can be limiting. So we tested what would happen if we added some seeds, and you clearly see here the impact of this additional seed rain. And in that condition, the 50% cut was also appropriate for seedling establishment. And another factor that could be limiting is the availability of proper seed beds. Even though we did not see that effect in the old forest stands, mineral seed bed is also a very good seed bed for cedar establishment. And you especially see that with the artificial seeding treatment, where we had a larger amount of seedlings on disturbed seed beds. And well, this was a PhD study, so it was conducted over a limited amount of time, but we wanted also to have a look at the conditions that would be appropriate for growth. So what we did is we planted some seedlings and monitored their growth. So what we saw here is that the gaps were the best conditions for growth, both in terms of height increment and root collar diameter increment, which means that the best conditions for establishment may not be the same as for future growth, meaning that they would need more light once they are established. Another interesting point to note here is we are discussing how we could increase the amount of cedar regeneration. Well, enrichment planting in gaps could be something quite favorable. We see here that we had the mean annual height growth was 15 centimeters, which is not too bad. But being able to provide the good conditions for growth may not be sufficient to recruit large seedlings or saplings. Here you have data from 3 sites. In the OR site, which is the experimental site that I've been discussing just before, you see that we have seedlings of all size classes. But looking at another site here where we have more important browsing pressure by deer and the Penobscot experimental forest, you see that the small seedlings are at the same level, meaning that we are able to recruit some small seedling even in the presence of deer. But you see that they are not recruiting to larger size and they are not recruiting to the sapling size either, so that we're having a problem. Looking at partial cut that we conducted a long time ago, 20 to 30 years, we found that cedar was able to respond quite strongly, especially here, to the cutting, and that this level, this response lasted to easily 20 to 30 years. You see here on this site, after 30 years, you still have growth which is higher than what it was before. And when we look at the kind of trees that show the best response, interestingly here we have two residual basal area, but what I want to focus on is the growth, the post-harvest growth here relative to the pre-harvest growth. And you see that the major difference here is found within the smallest stems, meaning that they are those that respond the best. But quite interestingly, when you look at the absolute growth here, the largest trees are still the ones that are growing the best. And this indicates that you shouldn't be removing them prematurely. Let them grow until they reach proper size. And the last study, the last completed study I want to present is about cedar plantation. In fact, they were mixed with quite often with spruce species, and they had a tending history that was quite variable. But I want to focus on the middle one here that was properly tended. And what you see here is that after 20 years, most of the stems had reached the merchantable size, and even some of them had reached 20 centimeter dBH, which is quite impressive for a species that is known to be slow growing. So there could be a potential there. Uh, and now I will move on onto the studies that are still ongoing. So I will provide you with preliminary results. And in fact, this research is the results of another Cedar Club meeting where we identified browsing pressure as that should be a focus for future research. So we have 3 projects now that are focusing on that question. So the first one is about cedar regeneration under high browsing pressure. The second one is about cedar regeneration response to a strong reduction in browsing pressure. And the last one looks at spatial temporal variations in cedar regeneration in relation with deer. So the first project is the PhD projects of Olivier Villemain-Côté, and it has 3 chapters. The first one look at regeneration in natural gaps in the context of variable deer abundance histories. The second one looks at regeneration after partial cuts in New Brunswick, and again also in relation with deer pressure. And the last one is the plantation where we conducted some simulation browsing experiments. So the first one, we have learned that the deer population in the southern part of the Gaspé Peninsula has moved over time. So you see here, there are places that where deer was present in the early 90s, but it's not abundant anymore, and it has moved closer to the Baie-des-Chaleurs region. So we're taking the advantage of this and sample different times since the deer left the area, and we sample gaps within in each of these areas. And well, what we found is that in many cases, well, the small seedlings were normally not browsed. And we found that browsing was more abundant in the larger size classes. But I saw in the previous presentation, as I mentioned in the chat box, about hair browsing, and we see here that hair browsing was also quite present, and we had cases where we had signs of both hair and deer. So hair may be a problem also, but it is probably less documented than the deer problem. And here we have a graph that shows the impact of different variables in terms of cedar regeneration abundance. And all the blue parts here have a positive tendency of relative to cedar abundance, and all the red ones had a negative tendency. So if we focus on those that are significant, drainage class, and here it is the drainage class 5, which is the poorly drained sites. The one that we sampled had much more regeneration than the other sites, so this was a significant factor. Another factor that came out as significant was the time since deer left the area. But even though it was significant, the effect was not as pronounced as the effect of the drainage class. And in terms of negative impact, the fact that in fact, we sampled the gaps itself, and we had also some regeneration plot just around the gaps. So these plots were less regenerated than the plots within the gap. So you see that the gap is an important part of the regeneration dynamics of cedar. And some of these gaps may have been created by past budworm outbreaks or partial wind throw. And now the second chapter, which is under analysis right now, is regeneration after partial cut. So we went and sampled some operational partial cut. Roughly, the basal area removal was around between 30 and 50%. And we found that the browsing level was quite variable, both for hare and deer, and and also even when we focus above the 50%, 15 centimeter height threshold where we would expect to have more browsing. We also tagged individual seedlings to monitor their fate over time. And we saw that some sites were clearly used during winter, others seems to have been used only in the past, but the seedlings that we tagged were not damaged too much. So one question that is raised is that since they have used these places before and not anymore, or very little right now, could they be that their resources are lower and that cedar have no interest returning there because they would have better habitat elsewhere? So this is an open question. Another issue also is that when we are trying to assess browsing pressure based on the proportion of browse seedlings or browse branches, you see here a seedling that was browsed over 15 centimeters. So that's the kind of seedling that we would sample in that kind of survey. But quite often, the small seedlings, if they are browsed heavily, they will either completely disappear or they would die. And then we would not capture this effect. And we could underestimate the impact of browsing in these conditions. So in nature, quite often the level of, we have very many variables that are influencing cedar growth at the same time. So we wanted to have control over these factors. So we planted some cedar seedlings on the campus and then provided them, half of them with partial shade. And we did some artificial browsing, we could say. We clipped some parts of seedlings, both during dormancy and a few weeks after dormancy. And we either clip them once or clip them for a second time the next season. And we tested different intensities. So in one case, we only clipped the apex, and in the other case, we clipped the apex and 50% of the previous year growth. And well, the study here is still under analysis. But we were expecting at the beginning that the trees in the shade would suffer more from browsing because they would have less reserve, but this was not the case. Seedling in the shade seems to be performing quite well. And here you have the case where the worst case here was when we clipped the apex plus the 50% of the previous year growth. So if you see that at the end of the year, it had not recovered height in comparison with the control, and this remained the second year. After the second year growth, even though it was not clipped only once, and you see the same kind of thing in the following year if it is clipped in 2 years in a row. So clipping during the growing season seems to be quite damaging. And if here it's quite interesting here. You have a seedling that was where the apex was cut both years during dormancy, and you see here that this is roughly the same height as the control seedling. So it has a good potential to recover after that kind of apex loss. And the second study I'll be discussing here is a study where we took advantage of an outbreak, well, not an outbreak, but an event of the chronic wasting disease that occurred in a deer farm in western Quebec. And here you see the farm. So all the deer in that farm were killed, and there was a culling, systematic culling effort all around this zone, this deer farm. And in addition, there was another zone here where the hunting was intensified to reduce the deer population. So we decided to sample here what was occurring after 2 years. And I would say that the second year, the same level of hunting was applied everywhere. So we took advantage by sampling plus cedar stands within this region here, and other sites here outside the treated area to act as controls. In order to avoid the kind of problem I mentioned about assessing the browsing pressure, we use architecture types. So here you have the normal growing type, and here you have the arrested type, which means that the browsing is keeping the seedling under a certain height. Here you have the retrogress type, which was a seedling that was able to reach a certain height, but then browsing intensified and it was reduced back to the same height as this one. And the last type here is the release type. So it is that kind of seedlings that was later released and that was able to resume growth. So you can use that type of architecture study with any species. So we did that not only with cedar, but with the other species that were present and that sometimes were better able to show that kind of architecture. And we use what we call the principal component analysis to sum up all these architectural type and also adding the proportion of brown of the browsing on the seedling. And you see here there was an axis where to the right of the axis we had the normal growth, and to the left of the axis we have all the severely browsed seedlings. And we use that in a regression to try to predict or explain the abundance of seedlings over 15 centimeters. And two factors came out in the best models. The first one was the browsing index, which is what we have here. And the second one is the fact that we were within or outside the deer yard. And it is represented here by the color dot. So the blue dots here are for seedlings within deer yards. So you see here that the highest browsing pressure was within deer yards, and that we had almost no seedlings over 15 centimeters. And on the opposite side here, the lower browsing pressure was associated with higher abundance of seedlings, and you have a mix here in the middle with a lot of variation, meaning that there are also other factors that are playing there. We also want to look at how existing cedar seedlings responds to the fact that the browsing pressure was reduced. And here we have seedlings from the control area and those from the treated area. When you see that the seedlings in the control zone initially had equivalent or either better growth than those in the treated area, but you see here clearly a switch when the browsing pressure was reduced. So the main question that remains here is, will that be sufficient to enable these seedlings to reach over the reach of deer? It will depend on the evolution of the deer pressure in the next few years. And the last study I'll be presenting here is by Béatrice Capola, and it is supervised by Jean-Pierre Tremblay. This is a biology student then. And what she'll be doing is to evaluate the impact, the abundance of cedar in relation to spatial temporal distribution of wild-tailed deer. And she is considering a number of factors related to stand size, and also she has an additional study looking at the distance to unpaved road. So what she will be using is that she works with permanent sample plots in New Brunswick and Quebec. And she also uses data from deer abundance. And in New Brunswick, these came from wildlife management zone, so the data are at that level. In Quebec, hunters are required to point out where they killed the deer. So we are able to have a map of relative abundance, let's say. That is probably somewhat more precise than what we can get from New Brunswick. But the permanent sample plots have some limitations. And first of all, the number of microplots to sample regeneration are usually quite low. And in both cases, and especially in New Brunswick, there is a threshold before the seedlings are counted. So we don't have much data for very small seedlings. So we decided to conduct an additional sampling on some of these permanent plant sample plots. And Beatrice used a bit the same approach as previously mentioned, looking at architecture types to take into account the amount of browsing. And she basically found something quite similar. But here, just to mention here, the axis here is reversed than the previous one. So the higher values here correspond to the strongest browsing pressure. And what you see here is that the small seedling size is almost not affected by the browsing pressure, but this is not the same for the other size classes. And you see here that with the higher browsing pressure here, you don't have any seedlings at all, or very few. So the next study, for which I don't have any results yet, it looks at the distance, the effect of distance to paved road. We've seen quite a few times an abundance of cedar regeneration right beside the road. This could be due partly to the presence of mineral soil, but it could also be due to the fact that deer may be avoiding these roads, and especially the ones that are more heavily used, because of the fear either for humans or for other predators. So what we did for that, to study that, is that we installed transects from rows to the center of stand that contains cedar, and we sample regeneration all along these transects. So this will be something coming in the next year in terms of results. So in conclusion, we have quite good information on stand dynamics, and we see that you saw that it is quite close to what Laura mentioned also in terms of results. We know some of the good conditions for establishment. We also have some good cues as for favorable conditions for growth, but we still have to work on the deer effect, and especially try to find ways to at least temporarily reduce the browsing pressure, so that seedling of cedar can reach out of the deer.